infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, hey everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. Now, Huntington's disease, or HD, is a progressive brain disorder that deteriorates a person's physical and mental abilities. It primarily affects adults. However, there is a form that affects children, albeit less common. Many describe the symptoms of HD as having ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's all wound up into one. Well, joining me today to look at Huntington's disease is the Senior Director for Mission and Scientific Affairs with the Huntington's Disease Society of America, or HDSA, George Yohrling, PhD. Dr. Yohrling, welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me, Robert.
You bet. So let's start out with the basics, right? What is Huntington's disease, and what's the cause?
Sure. So Huntington's disease, or HD, is a fatal genetic disorder that kind of, it's inherited through families, and it results in kind of a breakdown of the nerve cells in the brain, and that breakdown over time causes severe impairments to both motor function, or the way a patient moves, as well as their cognitive ability, and also psychiatric symptoms also emerge. So those are the three large areas of symptoms typically seen in an HD patient, both motor, cognitive, and psychiatric. And they vary from patient to patient. Not everyone has all three of those symptoms at the same time. Some may have more motor symptoms than others. The disease is caused by a known mutation in a gene called Huntington that was identified over 25 years ago. And what happens in this gene, which all of us have, everyone in every cell of our body have the Huntington gene, but in people with Huntington's disease, this gene is just a little bit too big, and it expands. And this expansion causes toxicity or breakdown of the nerve cells over time. So folks that inherit this expanded Huntington gene from their parents are destined to, if they live long enough, to develop Huntington's disease.
So who does it affect, and how many people are affected by it in the United States?
So what we typically, the numbers that we have suggest that around 1 in 10,000 Americans are currently living with or symptomatic for Huntington's disease, so that's around 35,000 Americans. But on top of that, there's another 250,000 Americans that are actually at risk of inheriting the disease, meaning that they may or may not carry the mutation or the gene expansion that causes the disease, but they come from parents that have the disease, or they may have a sibling that is known to have the disease, and they just didn't choose to be tested. So what we find is there's a gene test that people can take to find out if they are gene positive for this mutation. But most people, 90 to 95% of Americans that are at risk of inheriting HD choose not to be tested.
And is there a particular population that this affects?
Yeah, HD is pretty blind to, it affects everybody. It affects women and men equally. It affects black, white, Asian. It doesn't discriminate.
Gotcha.
There is certainly data to suggest there's a little bit less prevalent in Asia than in Western Europe or in North America, but there are cases of HD throughout the world.
Okay, you've already described some of the symptoms, and I saw on the HDSA website that there are various stages of the disease. Dr. Yohrling, can you describe these stages?
Sure. it's kind of a hot topic right now in the HD field. Depending on what article you look at or what website you'll see, there's 4 stages, there's 5 stages. There's actually some unpublished research going on that has kind of identified that there may be as many as 9 different stages of Huntington's disease. But really, what I like to think about is, there's kind of the pre-symptomatic or pre-manifest stage of Huntington's disease. This is where there are no kind of overt physical symptoms that are seen. Then another stage after pre-manifest is what clinicians refer to as prodromal. Prodromal is a stage where there may be some cognitive or psychiatric symptoms observed, but typically no motor manifestations. So, which is when the presence of motor manifestations and motor symptoms, that's typically what is used by a neurologist to formally diagnose Huntington's disease. When the neurologist is, 100% confident that the motor symptoms that he or she is observing in the patient are likely due to Huntington's disease, then they will do a formal diagnosis of Huntington's disease. And then then you have different stages of progression upon diagnosis, where early, mid, and late stage, or stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, doesn't really matter what you call it, but you just see a horrible progression, which varies over time in patients. Some progress more rapidly than others, but typically in the early stages, the patient will have difficulty with concentration and cognition. They may have some motor dysfunction that may progress to the middle stages where they're no longer able to drive or work and may start to become dependent on their loved one for care at home. And towards the later stages, unfortunately, HD patients are 100% dependent upon care, either in a nursing home or long-term care facility or at home, but from a loved one, for all aspects of their activities of daily living, from getting dressed and being fed until they're, typically a patient with HDs upon diagnosis will die within 10 to 15 years after diagnosis.
Okay, so based on what you just told me, so we typically see people with this disease middle age?
Typically the you predominantly see that the age of onset is between 35 to 45 or 40 to 50 or so. However, there is a form of HD that we call juvenile onset, or JHD. This is when children can obviously inherit this gene, and it's juvenile Huntington's disease is when it's diagnosed before the age of 20. And typically that's a more rare case. Maybe 5 or 10%, not even 10% of patients have juvenile onset HD. It manifests itself slightly differently than what you would see in an adult, where typically an adult Huntington's disease patient will have what's known as chorea, as an example. Chorea is a Latin word for dance, and it's a kind of prototypical symptom of someone with HD, where they have very uncontrolled, uncoordinated movements of their limbs, maybe their facial muscles, almost kind of looks like they're dancing. They're unable to control that motor activity. Someone with juvenile Huntington's disease rarely has that chorea. They actually look more like a Parkinsonian patient, where they're unable to voluntarily move their extremities. So it's still Huntington's disease, but in younger patients, this mutation, for whatever reason, seems to manifest itself a little bit differently in terms of the symptoms that we see.
You previously talked a little bit about the diagnosis as genetic testing and the neurology examination. So this is not something that you can go to Quest or LabCorp to have a test done. This is very specialized.
It is, yeah. It's not something that you can go to. Quest and LabCorp and groups like that will actually run run a Huntington genetic test for the clinics, but it's not something that you would go to, like a 23andMe and be able to test for. And nor do we advocate that ever happen, because
Gotcha.
there's a lot of ramifications that go behind being tested for Huntington's disease. Right now, once you test, if you were to test, we have HGSA has guidelines and protocols in place for what we believe are recommended practices for genetic testing for Huntington's disease, and they're in place to really protect the patient.
Mm-hmm.
We really want them to make sure that they're in a place mentally to receive the news, whether it's good or bad, that they are gene positive or gene negative for Huntington's disease. So that involves genetic counseling and meeting with neurologists or psychiatrists or psychologists to really kind of set the support network in place before delivery of the news of the gene status. And by circumventing that, by going to something like a 23andMe, would really be put the patient in an unfortunate situation. If they were testing, because once you test for positive for the disease, while you are protected through GINA, the 2008 law that protects patients from discrimination from genetic status for healthcare, GINA does not protect patients from getting, can prevent them, or it can prevent HD patients from getting access to long-term care or life insurance.
Mm-hmm.
So these are some of the things that folks need to know and before getting tested, and that's why we really encourage them to talk with a certified genetic counselor and HD neurologist or psychiatrist before getting tested.
Okay, great advice there. Dr. Yohrling, I understand there's no cure, so is there any research being done or anything promising in the pipeline right now?
Yeah, for sure. This is, you're exactly right. There is no cure. There are treatments for some of the symptoms associated with Huntington's disease. We do have 2 FDA-approved drugs. One is called tetrabenazine and one is called deutetrabenazine, just an analog of tetrabenazine. Both of them are for the chorea, or the movement disorder symptoms associated with Huntington's disease. And a lot of other patients, most patients have a lot of psychiatric or cognitive symptoms. Some of those psychiatric symptoms, like depression, anxiety, are treated quite well with antidepressants like SSRIs. But the real excitement now in the field is the promise of actually lowering the gene, or not technically lowering the gene, but lowering the protein levels of Huntington, which we know is really at the root cause of this disease. As I mentioned earlier, we identified the gene, the research community, in 1993, and that gives us 100% kind of diagnostic certainty that we know exactly who's going to get Huntington's disease, and we have a good sense that the cause of Huntington's disease is this expanded gene. So if we could discover ways to target that gene with novel drugs and therefore lower the levels of the Huntington protein in the brains of HD patients, we think that we could potentially modify the course of this disease. So luckily for us, technology has caught up to this idea, and currently in the clinical trial, we have a number of different approaches in clinical trials across the world that are looking to deliver drugs that target basically the recipe, the RNA or the recipe of Huntington, and cause that recipe to be ripped up or degraded so that there's less protein made. And so the most advanced of these studies is currently in phase 3 clinical trials, a global study called Generation HD1, which is a clinical trial being sponsored by Roche Genentech. And there are others like it from Wave Life Sciences that are all kind of they're testing a similar approach. So yeah, we don't have a result yet, but so far so good. The clinical results that have come in thus far have been promising, and they suggest to us that we can. There was preliminary results that were released about a year and a half ago that suggested that, yes, in fact, we can lower the Huntington levels in brains of HD patients. And that has created a real great sense of excitement and optimism, not only among families, but also among the HD research community.
Yeah, so it does sound very exciting. Is this considered a rare or an orphan disease?
It is. Yeah, it falls under the definition of a rare disease. The way the FDA designates or declares a rare disease is when it's a disease that has less than 200,000 patients in the United States, and with 30 to 35,000 symptomatic patients currently, it falls well within in the lines of a rare disease.
Yeah. Well, clearly this disease not only takes a horrible toll on the patient, but I have to imagine on the family also. Is there any help out there for family members dealing with this difficult situation?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Robert. I mean, it's a devastating disease, not only for the patient, but for the entire family. As you know, it runs through families, so it's inherited and passed down through families, but oftentimes, there are other family members that are also gene positive for this disease that bear the burden of not only battling the disease, but are also caregivers for either their mother, their father, their sister, their brother. That's one of the things that HDSA tries to do, is to try to provide some support mechanisms for patients and caregivers. And we have a number of different resources, both online or written, or publications, in-person meetings like our national convention that's held every year. This year we're holding it in Boston, June 27th to the 29th. But we run around 150 to 160 support groups around the country, all scattered throughout the country, that are places where families and caregivers can go and meet with others that are in their situation and hopefully find that social support and guidance that they need to kind of get through the day, and maybe even learn some interesting or ways to combat this disease at home, to make their quality of life, either for themselves, the caregiver, or for their loved one that's suffering from HD, a little bit better.
Yeah. Now, you just talked about some of the things that HDSA does. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the society and the work that you guys do up there?
Absolutely. Yeah. So HDSA is the premier nonprofit organization in America that's, we're really dedicated to our mission being improving the lives of everyone affected by Huntington's disease. So not only just the patient, but the entire family. And the way we do that in achieving our mission is I look at it as 5 core areas in which we focus our resources. First and foremost, it's on care, in clinical care, and HDSA has a network of over 50 centers of excellence, clinical centers of excellence around the country. These are places where patients and caregivers can go and get their expert multidisciplinary care for Huntington's disease, from all the way from genetic counseling all the way towards late stage HD care. These are places that have been vetted by HDSA, supported by HDSA, and provide great care for the family. So that's first and foremost what we do in terms of providing care. We also are a strong supporter of HD research. So we have research programs where we're trying to better understand Huntington's disease, and HDSA has kind of made a strategic decision with our research portfolio to focus most of our research efforts and dollars on understanding HD in the one model organism, for lack of a better term, that actually gets HD, and that's humans. There's a lot of great research that's going on out there. People see about curing a mouse or a rat or a fly of Huntington's disease or some other disease, and while that's exciting, it's still a fly or a rat or a mouse, and most times those observations just simply don't translate into the human situation. So HDSA focuses their research efforts on trying to understand this disease in people that we're trying to treat. So we have a lot of research programs dedicated to that. We also support advocacy efforts. We actually have we're trying to actually this month to reintroduce a bill in Congress called the HD Parity Act, which would waive the 2-year waiting period that patients diagnosed with Huntington's disease currently have to they have to wait 2 years after being diagnosed to get Medicare access. We are also provide, as I think I alluded to, the support groups, and we providing social support around the country through a network of social workers. We have over 70 social workers around the country, and these are really our troops on the ground scattered throughout the country that are really a phenomenal resource for HD families. They are the ones that they call us in their national office in New York City, and they're looking for support in Florida. While we know some of the great work that's going on in Florida, these social workers know everything, and they're plugged into the local state regulations relating to, whether it's Medicaid or Medicare, or know the ins and outs of some great placements in long-term care facilities, or they know the doctors, or they know the genetic counselors that are local, and so they're a great resource for families. So we at HGSA spend a lot of resources funding and supporting social workers around the country. And then finally, we pride ourselves in education, not only education of families that may, be broadsided by Huntington's disease and have, they didn't think they ran in their family and they need to learn about it. We hold educational events around the country for them, but also for educating physicians. And as many HD families can attest, they are, they may see a doctor for their HD, and that might be that doctor. They may be the only HD patient this doctor ever sees. So they're frustrated, the family members, because they're actually educating the physicians about Huntington's disease. And we are trying very hard to educate clinicians and other ancillary health professionals like physical therapists and speech-language pathologists and genetic counselors about HD around the country, so that this burden doesn't fall onto families. They have enough to deal with for them to be educating the physician about what HD is. So that's just a few of the things that HGSA does. Sorry for rambling about that, but
no, not a problem. Yeah, it sounds like you guys are doing some wonderful work up there. Dr. Yohrling, if someone would like to learn more about this disease, which is pretty rare, or about your organization, where can they go?
Sure. We can certainly go to hdsa.org, our website, and learn more about Huntington's disease and some of the services that we provide. If there are family members out there that are interested in the really exciting research that's going on and interested in participating in clinical trials, HGSA also has a website that is kind of like a clinical trial match.com type of service called hdtrialfinder.org. So hdtrialfinder.org will take you to our website. It's a database of currently recruiting HD clinical trials in North America. So those are two great resources to learn more. And then I also urge families that if you see press releases that are out there about HD, another great resource is our partners at HD Buzz. They have a tremendous website. It's called, it can be found at hdbuzz.net. And this is a website that kind of tries to cut through the hype of the news that you might see on your Google alert, where they've, lo and behold, somebody in a press office in some institution is declaring that they've cured Huntington's disease. This group at HD Buzz is a bunch of scientists and clinicians, HD scientists and clinicians that translate those press releases or findings into lay language that families can understand. So that's a really great resource for kind of understanding the latest and greatest that's going on.
Well, good stuff. And I will publish the various links when I publish the podcast on the website later on. And I want to thank you, Dr. George Yohrling, for your time and your expertise, sir. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. It's been a pleasure, Robert. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, have a great day, sir.
All right. You too.